Do you ever cancel plans not because you don't like the people, but because the idea of being alone that night just sounds better? Maybe you've noticed you feel more like yourself after a quiet weekend than after a busy social one. Maybe people have called you closed off or told you that you need to get out more, and part of you just quietly disagreed. If that sounds familiar, this isn't a video about being broken or antisocial or afraid of connection. This is about understanding what's actually happening in the mind of someone who genuinely prefers their own company, and why that preference is far more common and far more misunderstood than most people realize. Here's something people get wrong constantly. They assume that preferring solitude means disliking people or hiding from something. But psychologically, wanting time alone and struggling socially are two completely different things, and mixing them up is where most of the misunderstanding starts. Some people are genuinely energized by their own company. Not because something is wrong, but because their mind processes the world differently, recharges differently, and finds meaning differently than someone who thrives on constant interaction. Let's break down exactly what's going on beneath that preference. 1. Their energy works in the opposite direction. The concept, introversion, and the energy model. The most basic thing people misunderstand about solitude lovers is assuming it's about confidence or fear. Really, it's about energy direction. Psychologist Carl Jung's original framework on introversion describes it simply: extroverted people gain energy from external stimulation, while introverted people gain energy from internal reflection and lose energy in prolonged external stimulation. This means a social event isn't inherently bad for someone who prefers solitude, it's just costly. Every conversation, every new person, every hour of stimulation draws down a battery that only recharges in quiet. It's not dislike, it's depletion. This shows up as someone who genuinely enjoyed the party and still needs the entire next day alone to feel like themselves again. It's not that the event was too much emotionally, it's that their nervous system simply runs on a different fuel source. 2. Alone time isn't empty, it's where they process. The concept, internal processing style. For a lot of people, thinking happens out loud, through conversation, through talking something through with someone else. For people who prefer solitude, thinking often has to happen in silence first, before it's ready to be shared at all. This is called an internal processing style, working through emotions, decisions, and ideas privately before external input feels useful or even bearable. Being interrupted mid-process, even by someone well-meaning, can feel disorienting, like being pulled out of something important. This is why someone might go quiet after a stressful day, instead of wanting to talk about it immediately. They're not shutting you out, they're doing the internal work first, the same way someone else might need to talk it out loud immediately. Different wiring, same need to make sense of things. 3. Solitude feels like safety, not isolation. The concept, emotional regulation through solitude. For many people who prefer being alone, solitude isn't a retreat from the world, it's a return to a baseline where their nervous system finally settles. Constant social input, even pleasant input, keeps the brain in a state of low-level monitoring, reading tone, managing impressions, tracking multiple people's reactions at once. Alone time removes that monitoring completely. There's nothing to manage, no one to read, no impression to maintain. For some people, that absence of social effort is where genuine relaxation actually starts, not where loneliness begins. This shows up as someone who describes their quiet apartment, an empty house, or a solo walk as the most peaceful part of their day, not because they're avoiding people, but because that's genuinely where their body and mind exhale. 4. They value depth over frequency in relationships. The concept, selective social investment. People who prefer solitude often aren't building fewer relationships out of avoidance, they're building fewer relationships on purpose, investing deeply in a small number of people rather than spreading connection thin across many. This is a completely different social strategy, not a deficient one. Quality over quantity isn't just a saying for these people, it's often a genuine psychological preference, one meaningful 3-hour conversation over 10 short, pleasant ones. Depth feels nourishing in a way breadth simply doesn't. This shows up as someone with a small, tight circle of people they do anything for and very little interest in expanding it just for the sake of having more friends. It can look antisocial from the outside, but inside, it's actually one of the more intentional forms of connection there is. 5. Overstimulation hits them harder than most people realize. The concept, sensory and cognitive overload. Noise, crowds, bright lights, multiple conversations happening at once, these things register differently in the nervous systems of people who lean heavily towards solitude. What feels like normal background stimulation to one person can feel like genuine sensory overload to another. This isn't about being fragile, it's about threshold. Everyone has a point where input becomes too much to process comfortably, and for people who prefer solitude, that threshold tends to sit lower, meaning they hit overload sooner in loud, crowded, or fast-paced environments. This is why someone might leave a gathering early, not because they weren't enjoying it, but because their system quietly crossed from engaged into overwhelmed without much warning. Removing themselves isn't rejection of the people there, it's regulation of their own nervous system. 6. Being alone doesn't mean being lonely. The concept, the distinction between solitude and loneliness. Psychologically, solitude and loneliness are not the same experience, even though they look identical from the outside. Loneliness is the painful gap between the connection you want and the connection you have. Solitude, for someone who prefers it, is simply having exactly the amount of alone time they wanted. This distinction matters because people often assume anyone alone must be missing something. But for a genuine solitude-preferring person, an evening alone isn't a consolation prize. It's the actual first choice, chosen freely, not settled for. This shows up as someone confidently saying, "I just want a quiet night in," and meaning it completely, with zero sadness attached to that sentence. The outside world sometimes struggles to believe that alone can be a preference and not a fallback, but for many people, it genuinely is. 7. They've learned that people often misread their need for space. The concept, social misattribution. One of the harder parts of preferring solitude is how often it gets misinterpreted by other people. Needing space gets read as rejection. Wanting quiet gets read as sadness. Preferring a small circle gets read as coldness. Over time, many solitude-preferring people learn to anticipate these misunderstandings before they even happen. This creates a quiet, ongoing translation work, constantly explaining that alone time isn't about anyone else, it's about their own internal needs. It can be exhausting to repeatedly reassure people that solitude isn't a statement about the relationship. This shows up as someone over-explaining a simple, "I need a quiet weekend," almost preemptively because they've learned from experience that without the explanation, people will assume something is wrong. Often nothing is wrong at all, it's simply how they recharge. If you've recognized yourself somewhere in this video, I want you to hear this clearly. Preferring solitude isn't a flaw, a phase, or something to be fixed. It's a genuine psychological wiring, one that values internal processing, deep connection, and quiet recovery over constant external stimulation, and none of that makes you closed off or hard to reach. You don't owe anyone an explanation for needing a quiet evening, or choosing a small circle over a large one, or leaving a gathering a little early to protect your own peace. That preference isn't a rejection of other people, it's simply how you're built to recharge and think clearly. The world often celebrates constant social energy as the default setting for a good life, but there's nothing wrong with a mind that finds its clearest, calmest, most complete version of itself in quiet company, especially its own. If this helped you feel a little more understood today, hit subscribe, because we break down the real psychology behind the people and patterns that don't always get explained well every single week. See you in the next one.